Welcome to the first integrity recording of your EDRD 600 in the beginning of your K-12 reading teacher program. Today I'm going to give you an introduction to the National Reading Panel report that will be one of the major sources of reading for this course. It's amazing to me that this report is now 10 years old. It was published in 2000. The name of it is Teaching Children to Read, a Report of the Subgroups. At the time that it was published, it was very controversial. We're going to study some of those reasons for the controversy in this course. But to begin with, I want to give you an overview of what it was and what it accomplished, what it was supposed to accomplish, what it did accomplish. The National Reading Panel began in 1997. Congress charged a panel of experts to do two things: to assess the status of research-based knowledge about reading, because there had been such controversy about reading, as you know, the reading wars for 50-some years. They also charged the panel with assessing the effectiveness of different teaching approaches to developing reading. 14 experts from the fields of reading research, colleges of education, teachers, educational administrators, and parents were selected for this panel, and they met over the course of 2 years. So what topics did the NRP consider? Of the vast array of topics related to reading, they considered what came to be known the Big Five, or the 5 pillars. In the area of alphabetics, phonemic awareness, and phonics were 2 of the 5 pillars. Fluency was a 3rd, vocabulary 4th, and text comprehension 5th. These have become, as I said, the 5 pillars of reading development. And as you might imagine, most of the controversy related to this report is going to focus around phonics, as you'll see later. What were some of the topics they did not study? Well, they didn't study reading development for English as a second language, ESL learners, because another panel had been commissioned to do that. They didn't look at issues such as vision therapy or motivation, not because these weren't important topics to study, but because they didn't meet the criteria that the panel believed that they needed to follow, which is located here. The criteria for study inclusion: first of all, they started with a database of over 100,000 reading-related reports. But they winnowed these down considerably by these criteria. First of all, the study had to be published in a peer-reviewed journal since 1966. So earlier studies weren't looked at. Remember that Jean Chall had done that extensively in 1967. If it also was not peer-reviewed, there was no guarantee that it had been rigorously designed and accepted for publication in a premier journal. It also needed to be a study published in English about learning to read in English. The subject of the studies needed to be reading development from preschool through 12th grade. The study needed to have well-defined instructional procedures, such that they could be replicated by classroom teachers. The sample size needed to be large enough to be useful so that they could make extrapolation of the findings to classrooms. And the studies needed to be either experimental or quasi-experimental. Let me explain what that means. Quasi-experimental does not mean inferior, as some people believe. The only difference between an experimental study and a quasi-experimental study is that in a quasi-experimental study, the children assigned to each group are non-random. For example, existing classrooms are used to assign one group of kids to the treatment and one group of kids to the control group. In a true experimental study, the children are randomly assigned to either a treatment or a control group. Now, from what you know of education, you can see why educational research generally is more quasi-experimental than in medical research. In medical research, it's well defined that experimental is the gold standard, and patients are randomly assigned to either a treatment or a control. It's not that easy in education. Let's say I, as a researcher, want to come in and say to 2 first-grade teachers, let me take all of your kids, mix them up, and randomly assign them back to one or the other of you. I don't think that would be possible. But it is generally possible to come in and say, would you as a first-grade teacher do the treatment that we're studying, and would you as the other first-grade teacher continue to do the regular curriculum to see whether this new treatment is superior? So how did the NRP summarize their findings? There's some very important terms that you're going to meet in this Chapter 1 on methodology, and so I'll just review them, just in case your Statistics 101 is a little fuzzy. We'll go back through some of the major things, plus the ones that are specific to this particular report. First of all, understanding mean and standard deviation. I think that everyone understands that mean means the average score of all the participants. An important term in educational research or research of any kind is standard deviation. And the standard deviation means how much on average the scores vary from that mean, from that average. For example, with IQ tests, the mean is 100 and the standard deviation is 15. So plus 1 standard deviation on the IQ test would be 115, minus 1 standard deviation on the IQ test would be 100 minus 15, which is 85. And what that means is 68% of all people tested, if they form a normal distribution, will score between that plus 1 and that minus 1 standard deviation, between an IQ of 85 and an IQ of 115. It is only experimental and quasi-experimental studies that can determine the probability of a difference between the means of the treatment and the control group. And that's why these 2 kinds of studies were chosen by the NRP to examine, because remember that the charge from Congress was to see what was classroom ready, what research existed that compared a new treatment to an existing program to find out whether the new treatment was more effective or not. It's important to understand the term meta-analysis because the NRP report is essentially a meta-analysis. An analysis is an examination of one study. A meta-analysis is an analysis of a group of studies on the same topic. The means and standard deviations of all the control groups and all the treatment groups are combined. For example, what is the probability that the treatment group, for example, phonics instruction, outperform the control group, for example, the regular basal program? So in this question, all of the studies that contrasted a phonics program against a regular basal program or a regular program of some kind were combined together to make one grand mean and one standard deviation for each group to see whether in total there was a difference. So a meta-analysis is an analysis of one study. There may be 28 studies in a meta-analysis. There may be 15 studies. There may be more than that. You'll see as we go through the chapters. P-value is very important for you to understand. The p-value is essentially what is the probability that a difference this big, or that this big of a difference would happen by chance alone. P-value of 0.05 means that if the study were to be repeated 100 times, and only 5 out of 100 times would this big of a difference occur by chance. So it's a pretty good possibility excuse me, that there is a difference, that the difference between the two groups is not zero. A p-value of 0.001 means that in only 1 out of 1,000 times would this big of a difference happen by chance alone. So in both of those cases, you can be pretty sure that there is a difference. However, that does not tell us how big of a difference there is between the groups. It only says that the difference is not zero. So if the difference between a phonics program and a regular basal program is p 0.001, that only means that it's highly, highly probable that this is not a chance difference. But we don't know how much of a difference that there is. To know that, we need to know the effect size, which the NRP also computed. The effect size does tell us how big the difference is between the treatment and the control groups. There are conventional judgments of the effect size. 0.30 or less is a very small effect. 0.50 is considered a moderate effect. If you see an effect size of 0.50 or greater, you as a classroom teacher can say with confidence, this is something I should pay attention to, if in fact I'm teaching at the level that this study addresses. 0.80 or greater is a very large effect. So again, is it educationally significant? Generally, you want to see 0.50 or greater. So remember that as you read the effect sizes as you're going through the NRP report. Let me show you what that means in terms of the normal curve and the effect size. An effect size of 0.50 means that the treatment group is on average a half a standard deviation, 0.50, greater than the control group. So if you see that little hash mark halfway up between 0 and +1 standard deviation, and you look down below, it's about the 70th percentile. So instead of the control group being at the 50th percentile, which is where they would be placed in this kind of effect size study, the treatment group would be at the 70th percentile. Let's make that hypothetical and say that, in effect, one study showed that the average score is at 3rd grade, and the standard deviation is 1 grade level. So that means +1 standard deviation would be 4th grade, right? So a 0.5 effect size means that the treatment group, on average, scored at 3.5 grade level. So you as a teacher, I think, would agree that treatment that placed the treatment group a half a grade level higher than the control group, the regular curriculum, would be important. That's one example of what it might be. Let's also talk about something that will come up again and again in this report, which are moderator variables. Moderator variables are subgroups within a group. That is, the ways within which a research sample can be subdivided to look at it differently. For example, within a group of elementary school children in a phonics study, again, I'll just use that as a hypothetical example, you could look at whether kids who are from low socioeconomic status have a greater response to phonics than kids from middle and high economic status. That's one moderator variable with the way a subgroup could be defined within the whole group that was studied. Another way is if multiple grades were studied, you could look at whether phonics instruction was more effective at lower grades than at higher grades, at 2nd grade, for example, rather than 6th grade. You could also look at reading level, whether a treatment is more effective for kids who are struggling readers versus average readers or advanced readers. Another moderator variable could be length of treatment. You're going to find out in the phonics, the chapter on alphabetics in the phonics section, that they talk about whether a shorter length of treatment of the phonics is just as effective or even more effective than a longer treatment. So here's an example. Is phonics versus the regular basal more effective for low income compared to higher income students? So keep in mind that moderator variable means the subgroups within which a research sample can be subdivided to take a look at different characteristics of the children that were studied. That's Chapter 1, an overview of Chapter 1. And now let me talk about a preview of Chapter 2, which you will be reading for next time. You're going to read Chapter 2, Alphabetics, and just Part 1, Phonemic Awareness Instruction. Let me warn you before you even start reading that this is a very, very redundant chapter. It's got a lot of obscure and somewhat obtuse sentences in it. It's a perfect example of what happens when a committee writes a report. It's sort of like everybody needs to have their favorite sentence in there. You'll find that the other chapters read much more fluently. But in any case, I want to front load you with the important terms so that you're ready for slogging through this part of it, because it's got some very, very important parts to it that we will study in the second session. Phonological and phonemic awareness are two terms that are very often used, extremely often used, and not always used real correctly. Phonological awareness is the term for the umbrella awareness that spoken language can be analyzed for word boundaries, syllables, and phonemes. An example of phonological awareness could be, say, cowboy. Take away boy, what is left? So that's an analysis at the syllable level. Another one could be, listen, how many words do I say in the sentence? I ran home fast. So if a child can count that there are 4 words in that spoken sentence, then they understand word boundaries. Phonemic awareness becomes the awareness that words can be analyzed by sounds. And phonemic awareness has 2 levels. One is spoken, and I have to tell you that the spoken level of phonological awareness and the spoken level of phonemic awareness is very often given short shrift in our commercial programs, even today, 10 years after the NRP. But at the spoken level, I would say, listen, children, the word is bat. Take away b. What is left? Notice I'm not showing any letters in that condition. I'm just giving the word, asking them to take away the sound. At the auditory visual level, which also qualifies now as phonics, phonemic awareness is asking the children, what letter makes the sound b? By the way, you notice that there are slashes surrounding the letter B. Whenever you see that, don't say the name of the letter, say the sound. B, b, okay? So let's talk about the different terms for spoken versus written letters. A phoneme is a distinct speech sound. For example, the sound O. That's the long O. I didn't put a line over it. How many phonemes are there in English? If you answered 41 to 44, you would be correct. Linguists disagree whether there's 41, 42, 43, or 44. I personally believe there are 41, but very often they say 44 sounds. Do you know how many vowel sounds we have in English? This time, if you guessed 19, you're correct. That's in great contrast to, for example, Spanish, where there are 5 vowel sounds. So those are phonemes, and right away you can see that there's a difference between the number of phonemes we have and the number of graphemes. A grapheme is the letter or letters that represent a sound. For example, that sound O can be represented by O. It can be represented by the letters OA also. How many graphemes can represent one sound? If to this question you answered 4, you are correct, because, for example, the letter O could also be represented by O-U-G-H. So a grapheme can be anywhere from 1 to 4 letters, representing one phoneme. There are 44 phonemes in English. These are very, very important terms that you're going to be seeing over and over again in your professional literature as we progress through this reading program. It's also important to take a look at phonemic skills. In the last few years, I've seen a great increase in teaching of phonemic skills in kindergarten and first grade. So this may not be all that new for many of you, unless perhaps you're a high school teacher in this program. But phoneme blending, an example would be, what word am I saying? And the kids blend the word to say hat. Phoneme counting would be how many sounds you hear in church. If you answered 3, you would be correct. Phoneme segmenting is taking a word apart. Remember now, I'm doing this all auditorially. The children are not seeing these written words. The word is mat. Say each sound slowly. So if the children say t, they have segmented the word mat. Phoneme deletion, an example is, the word is mat, take away what is left? And the answer, of course, would be at. Now, if kids can do all of those things, then they have the underlying skill needed to be successful at cracking the code with phonics. And if they can't do that, I'm going to show you in session 2 what occurs even after they have learned all of their sounds and all of their letter sounds so that they can see the letters and say the right sounds, but they cannot blend because they can't do all of these skills. These are very, very important pre-letter knowledge skills at the auditory level only. And most of the programs teach what sound the letters make and rhyming. But true rhyming is dependent on having mastered all of these skills. We'll talk about more of that later. For right now, I want you to be sure to know what these different terms mean when you get to the reading for this chapter. So, it's now time to go forth and read. For our second session, read Chapter 1 on methodology. I just went through the major terms of the NRP. There's a study guide in your course pack to go along with that chapter that will help you to extract the important information. There's also a study guide in your course pack for Session 2 on Chapter 2, Alphabetics, Part 1, Phonemic Awareness. We've just gone through some of the major concepts for this Part 2. And if you keep in mind that, yes, this is a fairly boring and redundant chapter, but there are also very important concepts for us to be talking about when we get back to Session 2. You'll be ready to discuss what it is the NRP found about the effectiveness of phonemic awareness training in development of reading.